So this talk, right, protect the business, prevent the threats, it's really about strategically, how do we do one thing? How do we do one control to reduce our risk? How do we do one or two changes in our environment which should have the biggest impact? And so oftentimes when we're thinking about that, encryption comes to mind, right? I mean, we're at RSA, right? The birthplace practically of encryption. But when we have those discussions and we sit down with a security leader and we say, you know, you should use encryption. I don't know about you guys, but I hear stuff like, no, we're good. We got the green lock. I think that means we're fine. And all my guys are doing BitLocker, so we're cool, right? I mean, that's PCI. And you're just like, So oftentimes it's very difficult to know where to put encryption. So oftentimes it's very difficult to know where to configure it. And then you add on the fact that breach after breach happens, and all these guys had encryption, right? No one said, yeah, we got breached because we forgot to encrypt. No, of course, they all had encryption in the right place. See, encryption that's misplaced or misconfigured, it's worse than worthless, right? It gives it that false sense of security. I'm cool, I got the green check. Yeah, but do you have protection against a SQL injection flaw dumping your database? I think so, because I've got BitLocker. No, it doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way. And then you go to the opposite side and say, okay, we'll encrypt everything, right? Put on all the protections, put on all the brakes, do what we got to do. And that runs against probably, definitely, the most fundamental goal of being in security, which is to protect the organization and protect the organization's ability to achieve its mission by protecting the technologies that enable that mission. So what I want to talk about today is the latest way that I'm thinking about getting to that goal, protecting the organization, figuring out what's the one or two things we should do. And the way that I'm thinking about this is from the perspective of the intersection between what's actually driving some value in our organization and where the criminals are actually motivated to attack, right? That intersection of protect and prevent. I'm going to talk through the protection side and give some insight and some analysis on how to pull that data to your security team so you can figure out where to act. I'm going to talk about threat modeling and threat actors and what they're going after and figure out how to pull that information to our team so we can figure out where to act. And then we're going to end up, part three will be showing some real examples of how you can bring this together, do the analysis, and figure out where to encrypt. And then hopefully we'll have a couple minutes left at the end for questions. All right, so protecting the business. You know, when we start to do this, any sort of thing like this, it's always the gap assessment. You're always like, all right, we're going to do a maturity assessment. We're going to bring in the analysts. They're going to tell us what's wrong. We're going to look our environment soup to nuts, down to the smallest screw and the molecular level. And then you get this fantastic report at the end of it. And I remember when I was a security officer, I used to love it because I got the nice little risk rank graphs, and it looked something like this. And you're like, okay, what do I need to do? Is this stare at it blankly because it's findings? Or do I stroke my beard and go, that's interesting. We should do something about that. It's so difficult, I think, when we give this huge pile of findings to actually know what to act out. And when you think about the essentials of a security professional, right? Knowing where to apply a control. If you get 1,000 things risk ranked like this, you're like, no, okay, good. We'll put that in the roadmap, and what that really means is that report's going on a shelf till next year when we have to attest that we did it. One way to get closer to the reality is, of course, to begin to look at the business process and figure out what we're trying to protect. One of my favorite ways to do this is with business impact analysis. Business impact analysis from business continuity and disaster recovery is a way to have a series of conversations with the business about what the organization's mission is and what they're actually building. It's a way of documenting what a critical activity is and what the impact is should that activity be disrupted. And it's a way to start getting a little closer to the alignment of the security team with the business. Now, I did one of these past fall, and it was great. It was like early morning. It's one of my first meetings with their executive team. It's like the 30th floor of a skyscraper, facing east, and inadvertently, I just had my back to the window. And it ended up being like a mafia movie. I loved it. It was like Get Shorty all over again. You guys remember Get Shorty? right? So it was like one of those things. So I'm sitting there in the window, and this lovely lady comes in. She's one of their executives, and she sits down. She's squinting at me through the light. I take a moment. I'm like, so tell me, what is it that you do here? Right? What value are you bringing? And she's like, what? Like, here, have a croissant. Let's move the table. Let's figure out a different way to do this. But through these interviews, we had several great discussions where we figured out the 3-4 things that really mattered in their critical process that, if they were disrupted, would actually take the business down. We found out like 80-90% of it was important activities, but they're like procurement. They're like, yeah, I guess it could be down a week. So what? So what? Like, so why are we securing procurement the same way as we're securing business origination? Some great insights came out of that. Coming out of a business impact analysis, we'll oftentimes have a diagram that looks something like this, right? Here's the castle we're trying to protect. Here's the people, here's the technologies they're using, and here's the facilities and key infrastructure that's inside of it. So that's business impact analysis. That comes from business continuity. Another way to get at this, a little bit more granular, is with the data flow analysis. So data flow, very common in PCI, right, is a way of documenting how the data actually flows from people to people, process to process, and where it's exposed and where it's not. Of course, in cardholder data environments and PCI environments, that's all we talk about, is that cardholder data or the PAN or whatnot. She flew here from an ongoing PCI assessment to give this talk. And so I'm doing this for the past couple weeks and the next couple weeks. But not this one. These guys are pretty good. We've been doing this for them for quite a while. About a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we did one. And we're doing this type of analysis. We're like, hey, do you have a data flow? And the guy's like, yes. A little bit hesitant, but yes, I have a data flow. Good. Can I have it? And he reaches into a bag and he pulls out this folder and flipping through. And he pulls out this piece of paper and he slides it across the desk. And this was not the 30th floor of the skyscraper, as you might imagine. This was more like basement level, no windows, unfortunately. Slides it across, so I'm in this concrete, and I'm like, okay, this is something out of a spy movie, and I look at it, and I try not to laugh, right? You guys do consulting, you can never break. That's the number one rule of consulting. His data flow analysis was a picture of a whiteboard that kind of whiteboarded what people do. I'm like, good, this is a great start. Thank you so much. We'll get right on this. And I start to put it away, and he freaks out. He's like, no, give me that back. I'm like, give it back? He's like, that's my only copy. Okay, I'll take a picture of your picture. So oftentimes when we do these PCI environments, especially new ones, they haven't done a data flow analysis. We have to start just at that level. And again, data flow analysis, very common in PCI, exact same thing applies in healthcare, right? Just flip the type of data from cardholder data to health data. So we can use these same methods. This is the way we protect, right, the wagon train that's coming up the mountain through the pass with criminals on the left and monsters in the shadows on the right trying to get to our secure environment as it goes through firewalls and secure enclaves and data warehouses. So that's business impact, that's data flow analysis. Once we have this understanding of what's in the business, once we have an understanding of what it actually is that we're trying to protect and what the value is, we can then go ahead and take a slice at control assessments. I get very frustrated, and I started with this, right? The whole like, is this that or a blank stare? I get very frustrated a lot of gap assessments because you try and apply the 500 latest controls from NIST to everything in your environment, procurement to business origination, and you end up with 1,000 different findings. You're like, what the heck am I supposed to do? So we take a very narrow look at the environment, just what matters. We take a very tight look at just what controls are specific to this, and then from that is how we drive our next actions. Specific to encryption, these are things, right, that I think we can all agree on are good encryption controls. Within the way we slice and dice this, there's various sub-controls we look at. But hey, are you protecting network traffic? You got the green checkbox. Awesome. That's locked. Are you protecting your active data and files? Are you looking at data and rest and system storage? BitLocker, fantastic. VMware, doing their encryption, right? The new VMware allows you to do encryption on their disk with a hardware security module for key exchange, pretty cool. Are you looking at your applications protecting data in use? Practically every major point of sale breach that we've heard about recently has all been this one. right? The Arby's attack that we recently heard about. One, I don't know why anyone eats at Arby's, but that's a whole other thing. Two, they actually compromised the point of sale system, and then we're sniffing all the cards, right there in Expo Trading. Same thing that happened with Target, same thing that happened with Home Depot. Databases, protecting sensitive information. You guys probably heard the Anthem breach and how that was discovered, where someone was like, hey, our databases are slow. I love the breaches, too, that are never discovered by the security operations folks. They're discovered by your ops guys. Our databases are slow. And they're like, why is our database slow? They start looking at, well, it's Bob Smith. Bob Smith is running this really long query. Go to Bob Smith's desk. Where's Bob Smith? On vacation, right? Why is Bob Smith running a long query? Well, it turned out he was phished, and they used his credentials, and they dumped the full database. Database wasn't protected, and that's how they got all the health information. So are you protecting the databases? Are you managing your keys? We'll come back to that one. Authentication, authorization, obviously vital once you have good encryption keys. And then finally, a program that maintains all those controls. Now, program is pretty vital. When we think about any one of these controls, so oftentimes we may do the thing, but we forget what's related to it, right? So if you think about each one of these controls, are you doing the thing? Are you encrypting your data? Yes, I'm encrypting my data. Fantastic. We're doing the thing. Are you doing the thing that allows you to do that thing? Well, what do you mean? Do you got data classification? Yeah, sure, we got data classification. I don't believe them, but good. Now we got the thing that does the thing. Fantastic. Now are you doing the thing that catches when you're supposed to do the thing, but you didn't? Say what? Do you got DLP? So you can know when it's supposed to be encrypted and it's not. Yeah, that's in the roadmap. Good. So now that you're doing the thing that helps you do the thing, you're doing the thing that catches when you do it, or supposed to do the thing but didn't do the thing. Do you get your policies? Do you get your procedures? Have you trained people? Do people know what to do? Et cetera, and so on and so forth. Organizations have encryption. Why does encryption fail? Because it's misconfigured, misplaced, or because they're not doing all the other things around it that allows it to be effective. So we start digging in that way. Some findings and considerations that come out of this. One is that, hey, encryption settings don't age well. Security doesn't age well. This is what makes this industry really exciting. Obviously, I keep joking about the green lock, but SSL was broken almost immediately. And now we got TLS, and they're trying to phase that out. I can't believe that we're going to support TLS 1 to 2018. That's neither here nor there. It doesn't age well. And that's just a cipher suite, right? That's not even counting all the software that supports the ciphers, like the OpenSSL vulnerabilities, Heartbleed, and the other things that you start to see. We always need to have a program in place that makes sure that we're checking to make sure that the encryption is still up to standard, still supported, and that the software that runs it is patched. The other thing that I find interesting is maturity assessments measure the feeling. And this can be kind of a gray area, but whenever you get those great risk rankings, we have to understand that that measures the feeling of the people we're interviewing and their understandings, right? It's a little bit ephemeral. If I'm staring at an executive with the light shining in my eyes, even better if I got a thug behind me doing one of these. If I'm in that environment, they're going to be like, we deliver tremendous value and all our stuff is secure. Good. Take them out to drinks afterwards, and you're like, hey, so, I hear that organizations like yours have these 3 problems. It's like, oh, do we? You wouldn't even believe how bad it is. Like, yeah. It's always that feeling, right? It's not necessarily the reality. There is, of course, a deeper reality. And that deeper reality is oftentimes only discovered by pairing the interviews with technical testing. I'll give you a great example. I'm over at the Emeryville Hotel. I don't know if you guys are local or Emeryville, but Emeryville is like a half-hour to 45-minute Uber, depending on if you get the right Uber driver and they don't go backwards. That's a whole other story. But so, like any one of us, we're always on our phone. So I'm on my phone, I'm working in this Uber ride, and I get a text from one of my guys. He's like, hey, guess what? I'm like, what? He goes, I did the interview. And I go, that's great. He goes, you remember how they said that they've got all that sensitive financial data? I go, yes. The one that they said they had was protected. Yes, the one that's in this secure file system that's on its own server and its own enclave. I go, yeah, exactly. That was an interesting interview and some interesting findings. He goes, you know what I tried to do? I go, what? He goes, I tried to open the files. So how'd you do that? He goes, well, I was on the guest Wi-Fi. So, wait a minute, how'd you do that? And it turned out that even though everyone in the organization thought there was these secure financial files on the secure server in the secure enclave, it was actually at some point in time put on the network that got to the guest Wi-Fi so people could get at it And they're having some issues, so they set everyone to have full access on the file share and everyone to full access on the files. They score great on the interview. Gap assessment, oh, real high. There's always that deeper reality, right? Always. And getting that takes a lot of effort, of course. But summing up the protect side of this, we need to identify those critical business activities, the business functions, and what they're doing to deliver value. We need to document that and figure out the data flow and how it flows to the network, figure out what that enabling IT infrastructure is, and then define appropriate controls. And when we define those controls, not only interview, but do technical testing to make sure they actually stand up. And not only interview and do technical testing to make sure they actually stand up, but look at the program behind it to make sure that they're doing the thing and doing the thing that allows them to do the thing. That, in a nutshell, is protecting the business. And a way we get a sense of where the bad guys can come, right? Because when we talk about preventing the threats, you guys all walk the floor? Do you see like threat is the new risk? Did you guys see that banner? And do you guys see like 1,000,001 threat providers? Everyone has threat intel today, which is fantastic. How do you absorb all that, right? My team is still trying to figure out, for a lot of my clients, just how to patch or how to keep our users happy, right? Or how to do user endpoint control. How do you keep up with this dearth of threat intelligence? It's very, very difficult. And one way you can do that is by knowing, of course, what we're actually trying to protect against. I'm going to start off by talking about the monsters we're fighting. You guys are going to know this, but it's all going to come together. Bear with me. So if you think about your wagons, right, your data flow that's going up the hill, the data flow analysis that's getting your data to your secure enclaves, what are the monsters that we actually have to worry about? Well, we all know about the script kiddies. They've been around forever. That the 1990s hacker movie that got so many of us into this field. Insider threat, I think, is very, very interesting because it's used to be only motivated by revenge. It used to only be motivated by disgruntled employees. There was a study done last month, study done in January, and what that study found was that there are now subscription services on these criminal sites where for like $900 or something, you can buy tips and intellectual property from companies. And these tips and intellectual property from these companies is actually coming from disgruntled IT admins. So the criminals are paying these guys to exfiltrate data, packaging it up, and selling it off as dossiers on criminal sites, on dark web, right? Which I love. I mean, I don't love, but it really changes the whole dynamic when your inside guys who have all the access are now the guys who are most likely to steal from you, especially in the day and age when we're moving to cloud and we're trusting these utility computing. Hacktivists, right, anonymous who want to deface and do brain damage. Cyber criminals. So cybercrime, of course, being now, in terms of dollars, bigger than drug crime. Cybercrime being now, in terms of hacks, one of the largest ways that the bad guys are financed in developing new attacks and motivated to get us. Cybercrime. And then, of course, the nation state, which I don't know about you guys, but who here is commercial as opposed to Fed, government? So a few of you guys. In the commercial side, I find a lot of my clients don't really care what monster it is. If it's nation state, if it's country X, they're like, okay, fine. How quickly can I nuke it from orbit, reload, get back to work? So I know a lot of work goes on to nation state, but it doesn't seem to be, in my space with my customers, something that there's a lot of interest in. So when we think about getting the data to the castle, and we're sitting there late at night, right, trying to get to sleep, but wondering what could possibly get us, we can start looking back at years past and figure out what some attacks happened. This particular data is from Hackmageddon. There's a link in the chart, but it's basically 2016 breach data. 4% of the breaches were nation-state actors. Again, that doesn't seem to happen so much in my commercial space, but over the breaches that led to sensitive data loss. 4.2 insider threat. That surprised me because now we're hearing about how often it is occurring and again being sold on these dark websites. I'm wondering if that's not because they don't get caught. Maybe they know the system well enough. Hacktivists, 11%. Usually reputational damage, but not direct impacts to our critical processes. And of course, that leaves cybercrime. The great majority of the attacks last year were, of course, cybercrime. So as we try and figure out where the value is in our business and where the threat is coming from, pretty quickly we can zero in that cybercrime is what we need to stop. And of course, they're going after everything we would think they're going after: your credit cards, your PII, your PHI. Now, one of the things I find interesting is in doing a risk assessment, figuring out what the monetary value is of our data if it was stolen and resold. Now, for the longest time, it's credit cards. If you had credit cards, which is why PCI is around, if you had credit cards and you sold that, it would be a couple $100s in the market. Then Target, then Home Depot, then, and now latest Arby's, right? So there's a massive amount of credit cards out there, which has driven down the price. I was in a session here where they posited that ransomware came out of Target because the criminals are like, man, I can't make money stealing that anymore. Now what am I going to do? So the money is now shifted more towards health information. So $10 per transaction for a card, $20 for PII, $60 for PHI. So if we think about the data in our records and multiply by that, we can get an idea of what these criminals are motivated to go after and what they're going to try and steal from us. And then we can make some good decisions about threat intelligence. Right? I wouldn't say let's consume all the IP addresses, consume all the indicators of compromise, read all the blogs, listen to all the podcasts, walk the floor, collect all those things, and no, we'll go nuts. We'll absolutely go nuts. If we filter it by what's really likely, knowing what's in our environment, here are criminals. If we filter on what's the likely assets they're going to go after, here are credit cards and health information, we can then figure out what the most realistic threats are based on actor, asset, and vulnerability. And from that, we can go ahead and do some threat modeling. We can take a realistic threat. We can figure out what that threat would do in our environment, how it would move from outside into that data and exfiltrate that data. We can do that with an attack path, right? So here's the path the attacker's going to take. And along this path, we can prevent it here. We can detect it here. Nothing we can do about that, but here's a couple other controls we can get to. So by the time it starts at point A, point B, we have multiple steps along the way, multiple chances at detecting and preventing, multiple opportunities to find and stop that attacker. Also from that, we can then begin to design some threat-specific encryption use cases. Who say, okay, for these attacks that are very likely, that we're seeing all the time on the wild, for these attacks that are very likely and will likely happen in our environment because we have the same conditions that would get an attacker in or the same type of environment they would break, here's where we would place encryption. So very much a threat-specific model. We do threat modeling. I like the attack path, which is in Excel, but it's kind of boring. Today what I'm going to be doing is showing you more of these threat flows. Probably the people in the front can see, the people in back can't. I apologize. But basically, it has the threat and all the different things that they would do. It has the vulnerabilities in our environment that will allow them to break in, has the defenses we would use, and it has, of course, the assets they're trying to get to. So if you got something like disrupt network connections or communications, that could be enabled by SMB man in the middle. That can be enabled by ESX vulnerabilities. We could stop that with encryption, or we could stop that with stronger DNS and patching, and of course, that all rolls back to network access and our sensitive data. So we can map out the flow of the attacker in our environment and figure out where, if we were to bottleneck that flow, would just have the strongest chance of stopping. Of course, that's where we want to put encryption. So a couple considerations out of that. Obviously, non-specific threat intelligence is not intelligence, is noise. If it's not specific to our environment, specific to what the criminal wants to do, and specific to what would happen given our assets, it's just noise. The other is encryption effectiveness is very, very threat-centric. Right? If we don't protect the database, but we've got a lovely HTTPS, we can dump that database and we have no protection. If we got this level encryption, but now we boot it up, well, all that's now being decrypted as it's running off the drive, and we can get it off a phishing attack. Whenever we think about encryption, as with any security control, it's very much specific to any one threat or vulnerability. Some fantastic music coming on. Okay, so that was protection, that was prevention, and now we're going to bring this together and show you how we would actually do this in 3 different scenarios and figure out where we'd put encryption. A couple things about this. These are realistic scenarios, but they do not reflect any of my customers or any environments I'm aware of. They're just things that we see very commonly. So I'll show you guys a flow diagram Then I'll show you guys a threat flow on it, and then we'll talk about controls and how we build a business case of where to put your encryption. First one is remote access to healthcare information. As with every major organization today, right? You do BYOD, everyone does BYOD. You got medical personnel, they want to access some stuff. That oftentimes would be over RDP, either a remote desktop server or computer, and then access back to your data warehouse, your EMR, your email, and your files. The way we lay all this out is using yellow if it's sometimes encrypted, sometimes not, red if it's unencrypted, and blue if it's always encrypted. So we can see up here the traffic to those files is not encrypted. We also will lay out lock icons showing whether or not it's encrypted on the storage level. So our EMR is encrypted on the storage level, but not the database, and so on and so forth. What's interesting about this environment is in analyzing it, we found that, hey, the EMR is pretty good, the data warehouse is pretty good, but they were storing a tremendous amount of PHI files in spreadsheets. It was too much of a pain to go into the EMR every time. It was too much of a pain to go in the data warehouse every time. So they had a process where they basically just dump everything out that they were working on and throw it in the spreadsheets in the file server. Now, SMB, if you guys are a red team, the first thing you probably think is, well, I could do responder and get the creds. And that's exactly one of the common ways that this environment would be pen tested and broken into. The other thing you could think about is passing those encryption tokens around to log into different devices. Of course, there's two-factor on the EMR, but if you stole the token that way, you could easily get into the data warehouse itself. This is what the threat flow would look like for that type of scenario. Looking at the information disclosure, elevation of privileges, spoofing. This is Stride, right? If you guys are familiar with Stride. So you could use Stride, list out how all the tactics the threats would use, and map how that would flow to the assets. And then show where encrypting the network traffic and authentication and multi-factor would intercede to stop those attacks. We did a control analysis that looked something like this, with a lot of weaknesses in the network traffic, the databases, of course, encryption keys, authentication, authorization being the reddest, and then we could layer it out in a spider graph. What I want to mention here is control coverage. So this is not necessarily the percentage of how strong the controls are. Again, if you think about the entire path, if we have coverage over these 5 chairs, 20%, we could lose any one of these controls, right? Think about AV only being 60% or any number of controls which are only periodically able to stop the attack. If you lay it across the whole thing, that gets you your control coverage. So it's a little bit different than total security, but it tells you out of those 8 domains, what percentage of the subcontrols, the things that enable us to do those things, were actually being met. And this ended up being a great way to make a business case for multi-factor authentication across the entire environment, as well as network level encryption. Also with that, again, we took that $60 a record and multiplied it by the records in those file servers to demonstrate the risk in the honeypot that was those files for a criminal. So that's health information. We'll look at cardholder information. This is a typical enclave model where it's encrypted to the web, but it's unencrypted internally. It's a typical N-tier model where you got your web server, you got your payment service portal, and then your back-end processing. In this particular environment, the customer goes ahead, they type in their values into the website, that does some payment processing, they exchange the cards down to your payment processor, TouchNet or whatever it was, and then they're storing all those cardholder data in the data warehouse. So when you think about where a criminal will go for this, could they go after the network traffic? Yeah, it's unencrypted. Yeah, sure. But then they have to parse out all the cards and collect it all and whatnot. They're only going to capture whatever transactions are happening when they're listening for that traffic. Could they sniff it off memory, again, like the Arby's attack? Sure. They could do it at the web server, the payment service portal. I was involved with a penetration test a couple years ago where they had an IBM mainframe as their payment service portal. And that's exactly what we did. We basically installed a memory sniffer, and just every transaction that flew by, captured it, grabbed it out of memory, and wrote it out. It's fantastic. It's a great demo at the end. But even that, you're only limited toward the transactions that were within scope for those days, right? The data warehouse becomes very, very juicy if they're storing all those records there. And if storing all the records there in clear text, again, could we either dump them out from an insider threat or could we get them elsewhere? So we can do our data flow on that, or threat flow, and we can then begin to do our controls analysis. Here what we saw, yeah, we're not doing networking traffic, so that's bad, we should look at that. We're not protecting it in use, so that's bad, we should look at that. We're not protecting our database, so that's bad, we should look at that. When we start having a really good indication of what controls are missing and what the value is both to us and the attacker, we can begin to figure out what's the one or two things we could do. Not a list of 1,000 things, what's one or two things we could do. Here the answer was tokenization. By replacing those encryption or the cardholder data with encrypted tokens and only storing those tokens so the data warehouse can still do its reporting. Only passing those tokens on to the provider, right, which all providers are now set up for. Only passing those tokens throughout the end tiers. Whether the network's traffic was encrypted or not no longer mattered from the perspective of protecting those cards. So we looked at tokens as being the answer there. And that also gets to a different philosophy, which is in many of these environments, if we're talking about the sensitive data, if we can get to a model where encrypting it everywhere and decrypting only in use, which is kind of the opposite of what we've been doing, right? Ever since RSA was 3 guys. If we can get to that model, a lot of things become a lot simpler because so oftentimes we don't need to decrypt it, right? To run a report, we just need a simple hash value that can tie all the values together, right? You bought 50 packages of this, you bought 60 packages of that. Back there in the back, you guys have been stocking up on all the wine. When we can run those reports, all it has to be is a hash value, all it has to be is a token. It doesn't have to be a credit card. So we can maintain that. Very rarely do you actually have to decrypt in so many of these modern environments. Same thing with social security numbers and so on. So if you take that, encrypt everywhere and decrypt in use, and you build a new application, right? You completely envision using modern technology, and we're using DevOps, and you name the buzzword here, big data in the cloud. All right, and we build this, and if we're encrypting across the web server, encrypting across the app server to the payments, if we're using tokens in both of those areas, we're good. If we're using file level encryption, we're good. Now, we can start to look at where an attacker might get to this and might go in the beginning. And where he's going to go first is that authentication layer. He's going to try and break in either by password guessing or by brute forcing, right? So the Yahoo breach where 1,000,001 passwords, you find that user, you find their password, and you try it on this corporate site. Happens all the time. One way to prevent that is saying, okay, fine, we'll do multi-factor. Challenge with multi-factor is so oftentimes organizations don't implement on the API. And I mean little organizations, like there's one called Microsoft. And Microsoft did this last year, they had this problem. Outlook Web Access had two-factor enabled, worked great. Outlook Web Access did not do it on the API. So you're able to brute force the API and then pass that token in. So we figure out where we need to put those controls in place. And again, we can threat model just the session management. Looks something like this. Stopping brute force, stopping the hijacks, the session prediction using multi-factor and encryption, and using things like OAuth. You can also brute force mounting those disks, because as the environment gets more hardened, the chances of your insider threat becomes more real. Are they going to mount one of those disks somewhere else, bypass all the file controls, inject code or what have you? So we could do a threat model just around the disk encryption. So let's suppose we're doing disk encryption, good session management, we're doing all the right things. Where is the criminal going to go next? Because one of the things we always have to think about is the fact that every control ultimately is making a better criminal, right? Every control is ultimately saying, okay, I can't go this path, I'm going to go around. And so often in these environments, what it then becomes is about key management. Now maybe that's the administrator who's stored the keys in clear text in his laptop, which happens way too often. Maybe that's the little bit more complicated environment. There was an incident response situation I was involved with a number of years back where they're doing everything. I mean, HTTPS, SFTP to transfer the files, SSH to manage. They had a hardened Linux host, you name it, they had it. And they were doing change management. And again, I like the Anthem story where they found it because of the slow breach. Here the guy was in a change management meeting and his server admin said, yeah, I can't patch that. And they're like, why can't you patch it? Like, well, because I don't have Russian language files for the patch. Like, we're an American company. What do you mean? And that was the little indicator of compromise, that when they started digging in, they found that they had been compromised, and they found that the Russians had put in a backdoor and installed Russian language files and had owned the server for going on a year. But management was like, it's okay, because you told me we're doing file level encryption, right? We're doing GPG, so we're okay. And the server admin kind of cleared his throat uncomfortably. It's like, yes. Well, GPG has a keyring, yes. The local keyring is on the server, accessible to root. And the bad guys have been root for a year. Oh, key management, right. And suddenly it was completely open, right? They had been able to decrypt all those files all along. Terrible. So even when you got full control, you're basically shifting, as we get this control coverage, the attackers to those weaker areas. And this becomes a really good business case for key management. When you have the ability to say it's encrypted here, here, and here, now how we're going to rotate the keys, how we're going to ensure strong key lengths, how we're going to get things done. Because ultimately, encryption without key management, right, it's not really encryption, it's just encoding. Because you've got the keys, it's just one more process to dump the data. So whether we're looking at it from the IT diagram perspective, and we're looking at how to protect all that data from the bottom on up, using things like storage encryption, virtual encryption, what have you. Whether we're looking at the database, looking at things like, hey, are we encrypting our columns or our database files or individual items? Regardless of how we're looking at it, ultimately, we're trying to get closer to the data. And the closer the encryption can get to the data, the better the encryption is. Specifically with this environment too, we'd want to look at ways that we could encrypt that data at the application layer. Here, looking at something like AES. AES has the advantage, of course, being standard-based, being quick, you can build it in the API, and once it's encrypted everywhere, you don't necessarily have to worry about the performance hit of decrypting it when you're doing your reporting. One thing is also too, there's a great big difference between a social security number unencrypted and decrypted, right? Remember I was saying earlier about do the thing, but then do the thing to see if the thing didn't get done? You can build rules around that to be alerted to say, okay, if it's not been encrypted, let me know so I know that my security system has failed. Conversely, if you're maintaining an old system, a data warehouse that has to report off credit cards or processes that need to show credit cards, you can use something like format preserving encryption. Still standards-based, which is nice. The magic of it kind of blew my mind the first time I saw it, was that when you encrypt a social security number, it still looks like a social security number, right? When you encrypt a credit card, it still looks like a credit card, such that all those other processes you're relying on can still work and function. It's not a real credit card, it's not a real social security number. If the thief stole it, he'd think he'd have it, but the minute he tried to sell it, I don't know, whatever happens to thieves when they sell stuff that's not sellable. But something bad, I would imagine. So we have those two different options. The only disadvantage here, though, is, of course, if the system fails, it's not really apparent whether or not that value has been encrypted. We can tie all those things together into one giant threat flow and look at all the different layers in that IT diagram and figure out which one we should tackle off first. Again, trying to identify which one would have the biggest impact. And so oftentimes the ones that have the biggest impact are the ones closest to the data. Format preserving, application layer, what have you. So that's how we go from an IT diagram, looking at every layer on up. That's how we go from a data flow diagram, looking at how the data flows to satisfy our business process. And that's how we look at a business flow diagram to bring it all together, to have insights on each one of those three layers as to where we need to act, what we're trying to protect, and what we're trying to prevent. So to recap, if we figure out where the organizations have value, we figure out what the criminals want to steal, that's where we act from, and in acting from that, we can help protect the organization and its ability to achieve its mission. Before I roll to next steps, this is all about a repeatable process, right? It's all about building muscle memory and building a program to do these things. It's about identifying those top threats. You could do that in a week, you could get a good insight. But if you only do that once, that's not going to bring security in line with business. That's not going to help us figure out where we need to act. You really got to do that repeatable. Some of the best programs I see have these processes in place where they do them quarterly or even monthly. Doing the flows, doing the analysis, having the interviews, and actually doing technical testing. And then backing that up with threat flows. And instead of just consuming all the intelligence and applying all the controls, being very, very selective in terms of what they read, what they execute on. So then within the next 6 months, if you follow this process, You get a good muscle, you get a good cadence, and you begin to have a really good understanding of what your business is doing and where you can act from. I think I got like time for 1 or 2 questions. So anyone have a question? Yeah. Yep. So the question is, encryption is a good approach, but what about decoupling the data items? Then there's no record at all to solve. So what I like there is instead of encrypting, if you never have to decrypt it or put it back together, then you can use things like data anonymous technology or data anonymizing services. So you either decouple it or you have enough value. So for example, let's say we wanted to do like an insurance study on a specific environment. We don't necessarily need your full address, my full address, our social security number. But we could have a value in there that represents one of you, one of me in this geo that allows them to still do the report and the analytics. So I like decoupling and I also like anonymization. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, that's true. I like it. And then once it's in the clear, you don't need to worry about it at all, right, if it gets stolen or what have you. Excellent point. Yes, sir. So the question is, how do you see the connection between DLP and encryption? Coexisting. So there's 2 points to that. One is, I love the use case of DLP as a way to make sure you've encrypted. So by scanning for unencrypted data and alerting on it, I find that very powerful to figure out where flaws in the processes have occurred and it's not encrypted. The second part of that is, what happens if I'm losing data, right? Someone's encrypted something and sent it through my environment. So what oftentimes happens with good key management is you can have your DLP service account have keys to that. So for example, PKware has this concept of a service key. So you can give your DLP a service key, and that DLP can read those files and do what it's meant to do and alert you when information is being lost. But it takes a lot of careful planning. It really does. Yep. All right, I'm out of time, so just in conclusion, this talk, Prevent and Protect, is all about doing good threat modeling, consuming your intelligence that way, applying threat-specific encryption for very specific tactics that an attacker is likely to perform on you, and moving the encryption controls as close as possible to the data. Once we got a good handle around that, it's all about building a program so you can maintain those controls over the longer term. Thanks a lot, guys.